Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining this session at Upstart. Thanks very much to Jason Dainter for inviting me. I've always been a fan of the Upstart Festival, so I'm here to support even through these global pandemic times. We are going to be talking about the mental health crisis amongst founders. What can founders do about it? Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Butcher. I'm the editor-at-large for TechCrunch. I'm also founder of Tech Fugees and Tech Vets, the non-profits. When we talk about startups, we talk about staffing costs, the cost of capital, fundraising, cost per acquisition, opportunity cost, but we rarely talk about the emotional cost of creating a startup. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Wil Schroter, who is based in Ohio and founder and CEO of startups.com. He's an incredible background, not least of which is launching the Startup Therapy podcast, where he covers a lot of the problems founders face and which we're about to discuss, including mental health challenges, stress, depression, and etc., and what to do about it. A lot of what founders experience is that mental health is their biggest challenge, aside from actually doing the damn startup. So, Wil, what do you think has been going on? Mental health has been going up the agenda amongst startups in the last few years for obvious reasons, but have we seen an increase in mental health problems, or are we simply uncovering the stuff that was going on that was always there before?
Mike, I've been doing this for nearly 30 years as a founder and CEO. So I've been at this for a long time, long enough to say that I've been through enough eras of entrepreneurship to say where founders were allowed to kind of share their feelings, share their thoughts, etc. And I would say this, when I started my first company in '94, no one shared their feelings. You just pushed them really deep down. No one talked about them. It wasn't okay to talk to them about them with your employees, your partners, anybody. You just kind of kept it to yourself, generally. Over time, I think we started to see this externalization of how people felt. And I think we saw that with the birth of social media, where the status update was a thing. I feel shitty. And finally, people were talking about that. And it didn't take long until that started to kind of bridge the gap to founders. And founders would start saying, I'm actually not okay. Is anybody else feeling this way? And then for the first time, another founder would raise their hand and say, I'm actually not feeling okay as well. And then it started to proliferate. And now you've got people like a Brad Feld, which will get front and center about issues around depression and things like that. And I think what's happened, thankfully, over the past few years is that we've started to open the door to have these conversations so that founders can honestly say, hey, I'm in a terrible place. And to be fair, we're all in a terrible place. That's the nature of what we do. This whole thing is a shit show. And there's no version where things are going really well. I often say there's only two types of entrepreneurs: those that are terrified of everything that's going on and those that are lying about it. Because there's no version where this should feel validating and rewarding.
Obviously, doing startups is very different to corporate life. You've got a job, you're punching in, punching out, that kind of thing. So there are obvious differences, of course, but you are still going to work, aren't you?
Right. Right.
But what do you see as some of the sort of contrasts between, obviously, most jobs are actually pressured these days. There's still stress in an average job. Hell, we're going through a pandemic and any job is stressful right now. But what are some of the differences you see?
It's a few things. For founders, we have a whole different level of commitment for how that job works for us. All of our life savings are in this job, all of our personal commitments. If I'm an employee, I committed to the employer. But if I want to get another job, that's not very difficult to unwind. How often do you hear about founders quitting their own company and just going and getting another job? Kind of never, right? Later on, venture funded companies, et cetera. But we're chained to this thing to the bottom of the ocean. So all of our mental health issues don't have an exit plan. If things aren't going well at the startup, everyone else can quit. We're stuck with this thing. So it's a very, very different relationship to our job. It's the equivalent of, I can watch other people's children, but it's very different when they're my children. I'm tied to them forever. Right. And so the connection and kind of the gravity of the connection is very different.
Right. Yes, of course. And do you think that founders are prone to mental health issues, or are they, because of the role they're taking on, or is there something else going on? Does creating a startup, does it attract people who maybe have maybe a kind of then out of the ordinary, for instance?
It amplifies mental health issues. That's really what we're talking about. Let's say that everybody had, just making this up, the same level of basic mental health issue. But when you get into the world of a founder, kind of like if you become a celebrity, the stakes in your life are so much different that it just amplifies anything that was already going to be a challenge. So we're all insecure in some way. But a founder's insecurities are tested so many ways, often very publicly, at so many levels, in a way that we can't validate. So Mike, you and I start a company, let's say it's our first company, and we're going out and we're pitching investors. We've never pitched investors before. Everyone's telling us no. We're dealing with a massive amount of rejection that we've never dealt with before on something we've never done before. Of course, that's going to tear us up emotionally, right? Yeah. We got to bring a product to market that's never been built before by people that have never worked together before with a customer we've never seen before. And they said, this product's terrible. Of course, that's going to mess with us mentally. There's just nothing stable about this path that brings about validation or certainty. And so all of our insecurities get hyper amplified throughout the whole process. There's no way around it.
So, I mean, we've identified the problem effectively. There's a litany of issues to do with this. And, if we were talking to people who weren't going to do a startup right now and we're thinking about it maybe in the future, we've probably put them off. But forewarned is forewarned, and it's useful to go into these things with wide open eyes. But what can we do about it? What are some of the, there's obviously practical things you can do, but I dare say there are other sort of less obvious ways to mitigate the problems that might arise.
First thing, and this is super critical, and I hope the folks that are listening have either done this or will do this. Don't go it alone. Find a group of other founders that you can talk to get these thoughts out of your head. And here's why. And to give some context, I've run a platform with over 1 million startup companies on it, and I've sat in founder groups that I've set up with 5 to 10 people for thousands of founders over 20 plus years. So I've got a lot of experience here. The problem with being a founder is it's a super lonely journey, right? Like, we often can't share how we're feeling with other people, like our employees, our spouse, etc. So we can never really calibrate our feelings. But when you talk to other founders, they'll more than willingly share their feelings. And you start to realize that the stuff you're going through, while shitty, is the same stuff they're going through. And so, like anything else in life, it's like when two moms get together to complain about their kids, it's validating because they both realize that both their kids are a problem, right? And they don't feel like it's just them as the mom. So what I would recommend you do, among other things, would be find other founders that you can just share with. Maybe just put an hour on the calendar once a month, sit down and have a drink and just say, man, here's what I'm going through. And listen to what they're going through and start to realize that it's not just you. More importantly, it'll be the first time you talk about your problems to someone else who actually understands them. So someone else has the same stakes you do, has the same experience you do, and can say, hey, I don't know if I can give you any advice, but I can tell you I feel exactly your pain. And that alone releases so much.
I see. So get other founders around you that you can, have a beer and shoot the breeze with, I guess. That's one thing.
Absolutely.
Is there a danger that founders, especially in the hustle and bustle of an early stage company where kind of everybody's in the team and there's not really a lot of management structure, there's really a lot of quite flat management, really. Do you see that there is a danger often in treating employees like peers and sort of unloading on the team almost? I mean, that's not just a mental health problem, that's a management issue, of course, but
it is.
That's probably something you're going to be tempted to do, isn't it?
It is. And early in my career, when I was the youngest employee there, we now have 200 people at the company, and I'm the oldest person there, so things have certainly changed. But I wanted to be everybody's friend, and I wanted to share exactly what was going through my head. And it turned out that was a really bad idea. I thought about it in terms of, well, hey, these are my peers. They'll understand what I'm going through. And I want to be transparent. So I want them to know what's going on in my head. I'm all for transparency and I'm all for vulnerability, but there's a time and a place for these, right? These people are also relying on you for their paycheck. And so while I'm not suggesting bottling all up, I'd be very mindful about where and how you share, because the gravity of what you're sharing when you're talking to somebody who's relying on you for their future isn't the same as just telling your friend. And I've learned across 9 different startups that we don't get the luxury of founders of just sharing whatever we want, whenever we want. And a lot of people who are coming from a world where they were sharing all of their thoughts and updates as they were happening in their head start to understand that not all this is appropriate. By the way, it happens again when you become a parent. You can't just share exactly what you're feeling with your kids at any given time. That'd be terrifying for everybody.
Yes, that's a very good analogy. And also I think one of the other things about startups is that, there's a lot of kind of big rushes in the beginning when you're,
Sure.
launching a product, getting some early wins, first customers, maybe a first fundraise, angel round or something. But it's a long haul, isn't it? And, what are some of the things that founders should be aware of, knowing that it's going to take longer than, a year or a couple of years, isn't it?
It's one of the biggest myths, Mike. Successful startups take 7 to 10 years. There's no way around it, right? And somebody will always say, well, what about this one company, right? It's the equivalent of saying, I want to be an actor. And what about that one person who went to Hollywood and became a star at 18? Yes, it happened. That's not how it happens. It takes 7 to 10 years. Do all the research you want. Again, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. I've worked with hundreds of thousands of different startups at different capacities. I'm telling you, and even in my own experience, it takes 7 to 10 years, which is another way of saying for the first few years, no matter what you do, no matter how much you kill yourself, it's still going to take you longer than that to be successful. The first 3 to 5 years are going to be mind-numbingly painful. No way around it. The problem is, in the first few years, you don't know whether this pain is leading to success or failure. It feels painful in the same way. We all want to believe that successful companies, year one we launch and everybody just raves about the product and it just takes off. That's actually not how this thing works. The problem as founders is we don't know that. We only know our journey, right? So we just see things are going shitty for us, and that's the only way we think about it. That's why I also say talk to other founders, talk to more accomplished founders. Start to calibrate what this journey really is. It'd be like playing any sport that you love and not understanding why you're not winning every game just as you start playing. You talk to other players like, no, you get your teeth kicked in for a long time and eventually you start winning. If you didn't know that, you'd just be totally turned off and depressed the entire time. It really helps to calibrate for expectations.
Absolutely. And I guess also founders aren't really alone. Technically, it's very likely they're going to have often a partner, a spouse, husband or wife, or of that, something of that nature. Certainly a significant other. That's very often the case, isn't it? So, they're bringing that person along on the journey as well. There's a whole kettle of fish going on there. What's some of your thoughts about, as a founder, going through the journey and also, having a life partner as well, having to go through that with you?
I find that the most important co-founder you'll ever have is your life partner. I mean, bar none. And here's why. And I don't just mean that to sound nice. I mean, I love my wife and she's a great co-founder in that regard. But the reason that matters is because most of the journey will be very difficult. The last thing you want is to have that difficulty amplified by fighting a war on 2 fronts. I go to work and everything's really hard and I'm fighting battles. But now I come home and everything's hard there too. And I'm fighting a whole other set of battles. Like, forget the relationship, but maybe my spouse was never that on board with what I was doing to begin with. Happens all the time, by the way. And now everything that goes wrong at work, I got to be careful about whether I bring that home, because they may just say, well, I told you so, or kind of just, twist the knife even further. That is the worst thing that can happen, right? The best thing that can happen is it can be your confidant. When I come home, my wife's been through this with me for a very long time. And when I come home, I just say, here's what I just dealt with. And she knows I don't necessarily need a bunch of advice. I just need to get it off my chest. But here's what's important. I'm not alone. I can get something off my chest, somebody that's listening that actually cares about my outcome, and then clear my head and go back into battle. If that were going the opposite, and again, this is the weight of your spouse. If that were going the opposite, and instead my wife made it 100 times worse, and then I go into work the next day even more angry than when I got home, it just doesn't end well. I mean, people fight through it all the time, but it is such a powerful game changer.
And I mean, there are, so there are obviously also like practical things you can do. You can exercise, you can eat well, get some rest, sleep, fill 8 hours. I mean, I guess you'd say that those were the basics. I mean, do you put much stock by any other kinds of sort of practical things, meditation or other things of that nature?
A lot of people will tell you journaling, but let me be a little bit more specific. Again, because most people are going through this for the first time, they don't understand like why some of these concepts or insecurities are really hard to manage or to wrestle with. The truth is, most of the problems that we need to deal with as founders, we're having a conversation with ourselves. In other words, we're our own therapist. So a lot of the times when something's frustrating me, I'll go through a long therapy session with myself. I'll just, fire up a tab in my browser, start typing, and keep typing until all the thoughts are out of my head. I've gone to so many different mentors, etc. I found personally that nothing was more cathartic in kind of like managing my own mental health, like capturing all of my thoughts and having these really hard conversations with myself to be able to figure out exactly where my head is at. It's, again, I know people journal, etc., but imagine journaling where instead of just writing what's on your mind, you forced yourself to ask yourself very hard questions. Incredibly cathartic.
Well, I'm going to give a time check because I think we're nearly towards the end of our session. We've got maybe just 1 or 2 minutes left. But you've obviously been running your podcast about issues around this subject. What's kind of the sort of community and audience feedback that you've had over the time that you've been running that podcast about these topics?
Sure. So it's actually been kind of overwhelming. When we started the Startup Therapy podcast, the focus was, let's focus on the founder journey, not the startup journey. So I'm not concerned about what TechCrunch is doing. I'm concerned about what Mike's doing, right? What's going through his head. And so we started to really dig into a lot of these topics. And it turned out that a lot of people were raising their hands saying, no one is talking about this stuff. No one's being dead honest, right? And we covered everything from what it means to have, a spouse that doesn't agree with you and, having to go to blows with that. We covered what's the emotional cost of all this. We covered why can't I be happy with making $250,000 a year and be successful with my startup? Why do I feel like a founder fraud? We literally just took everything that we've been hearing over the years and unpacked them in infinite detail. And people keep coming back to us saying, I've been thinking about this forever, and finally someone's talking about it, which I think is just the first step to what we're going to see a much, much healthier environment unfold for founders to be able to express what's in their head, and then other founders, who've been through this before, to talk about some coping strategies. I think we're in for a much better world, which I'm happy to hear, especially considering the time.
Do you I could talk about this subject a lot longer, but do you think that we're at the beginning of the journey that of unpacking a lot of things that haven't been talked about, or do you think there's a gamut? We've touched, not just this discussion, by the way, but the issue itself. Is there still a lot to unpack?
I think we're 10% on our thermometer bar of this issue, right? Globally. I think that there's a lot of areas where folks don't know what their reaction is going to be. Right? If Mark Zuckerberg posts today, hey, I'm actually having tremendous anxiety and mental health issues, I'm breaking down daily. What does that mean for Mark Zuckerberg? Right? I know what it means for their stock, but think about that. Like, I think the cost folks have right now to being honest is still extremely high, and that's going to be an impediment. But I think that's slowly breaking down.
Well, it's been fascinating to talk to you, Wil Schroter, who's the CEO of startups.com and also, of course, the host and founder of the Startup Therapy podcast. So we're so glad to be able to get to you today to the Upstart conference. I know, unfortunately, we're out of time, and I know there are sessions that other people want to rush to now. But Wil, thanks so much for coming on the conference today. And ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Butcher. I'm editor at large of TechCrunch. So thanks very much for joining us. Goodbye.